So we have covered the first two groups of biomolecules. So we have proteins and lipids, and today we're going to focus on carbohydrates and nucleic acids. So carbohydrates are something that you ingest a lot from food. So for example, think about rice, potatoes, bread. So all those things contain a lot of carbohydrates. Now, a lot of people don't like carbohydrates because they think that they contribute to their weight gain. So people are using some special diets which have very little carbohydrates to lose weight. Now, it is pretty efficient, I would have to say, based on what I heard, but I don't think it's a healthy choice. From today's lecture, you are going to learn that carbohydrates are critical for normal body functions. Now, there are two main purposes for carbohydrates, for how our body or why our body uses carbohydrates. So the first one is it's a vital energy source. Okay? So it's the number one source for energy when our cells need energy. A very good example is glucose. Okay? So our cells will use glucose to generate energy. Okay, so our cells can break down glucose, and when chemical bonds are broken, remember, energy is released, and our cells will utilize that energy to perform different functions. Another main purpose for having carbohydrates is that they can provide structural support and protection. So examples are cellulose in plant cells. Like when you eat celeries, there are a lot of fibers. You chew and chew and chew. So that's made of carbohydrates, and they provide that structural support to plant cells. Fungi, there are also carbohydrates, again for similar purposes. Arthropods, if you're not familiar with arthropods, this is a very large class of animals that include all the insects, all the spiders. A lot of people are afraid of spiders, and also some of the seafood that you enjoy eating, shellfish, right? Lobsters, crabs, shrimps. So those are all in the group of arthropods, and in their shell there is a main component, which is a carbohydrate. So we'll talk about that. So depending on the number of monomers in a particular carbohydrate molecule, we can classify this class into kind of three categories. Monosaccharides, so mono means one, saccharide means sugar. So this group of carbohydrates have only one subunit, one monomer. So they themselves are monomers. Disaccharide, you can guess, this is two monomers linked together. So di means two, so you have two sugar units linked together. That's disaccharide. The biggest carbohydrates are polysaccharide. Poly means many. So when you have three or more monomers connected, linked together to form one carbohydrate molecule, that's considered a polysaccharide. So I'm going to give you some specific examples. Let's look at monosaccharides first. So a lot of times we just call them simple sugars because their structures are so simple. There's only one subunit, one monomer. And good examples are glucose. Glucose is very important for our cells. Like I mentioned earlier, our cells will take in glucose, right, from your blood, and then they will break down glucose for energy. Now, this is our number one source of energy. So if glucose is available, your cells will utilize glucose first. And if glucose is not available, then our body may use fats or proteins, like what happens to diabetic patients, right? Because the glucose cannot get into the cells, so their cells will utilize other sources. Another monosaccharide is called galactose. Galactose can be found in milk. So I'm going to show you the milk sugar, which contains galactose. So that's also one monosaccharide. I guess I don't have structure for galactose here, but you can look at this. This is glucose. So you can see how many carbons? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that's 6 carbons. So galactose has exactly the same chemical formula as glucose, but the structure for galactose is slightly different. And fructose again has the same chemical formula as glucose, but the structure is different. Okay. So all these are very good example of monosaccharide. Now there are some other examples. So we have two here. I want to focus on this pentose. Pent means 5, right? So think about pentagon. So that's a 5. And then ose, O-S-E, usually indicates this is a sugar. Okay? So you can see aldose, ketose, glucose, they all end up with O-S-E, right? So because they're sugar, they're monosaccharide. Okay, so we are going to have this pentose with 5 carbons, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, in our genetic material, nucleic acid, which is DNA or RNA. Okay? So in their structures, there's a one component that's pentose, a 5-carbon sugar. Okay? All right. So usually these monosaccharides do not exist in linear chains. A lot of them do exist in linear chains, but most of them will kind of form this ring structure. So you can see the two ends, right, will meet, and then this is going to form a chemical bond. So in the end, you have these ring-like structures. So this is ribose in our genetic material, and then this is fructose. So disaccharides are formed by 2 monosaccharides, and then they are linked by a chemical bond called glycosidic bond. Now, glyco means sugar. Okay, so usually everything about carbohydrates, about sugar, has glyco in the word. So this is called the glycosidic bond. There are some good examples of disaccharides. The most common one that we use a lot is called the sucrose. So sucrose is actually just your sugar, the sugar that you can buy from grocery store that you use for baking. So that's sucrose. So you can see sucrose is or consists of 2 monosaccharides, glucose and fructose. Okay? Another good example of a disaccharide is here, lactose. So lactose is also known as milk sugar. And you can call it milk sugar because it is a type of carbohydrate found in milk. So lactose is again made up of 2 monosaccharides. So we have a glucose and galactose. Okay. If you remember galactose from here, galactose. So when you link 1 glucose and 1 galactose together, that's going to form lactose. Now there are a lot of people here in the US who are lactose intolerant. That just means that they cannot break down the lactose molecule into 2 subunits, the 2 smaller sugars. Okay? And when that happens, it's going to give you some discomfort. You're going to have all those symptoms. Okay? So that's lactose intolerant. That means your body doesn't have the enzyme to break down lactose. Okay? So that will lead to some discomfort. All right, and then we'll talk about sucrose. We also have a maltose. So that's a type of disaccharide that you can find a lot in plants. Polysaccharide. Now, if you have a lot more monosaccharides are linked together, form chemical bonds, form large chain structures, these are going to be polysaccharide. Okay? And usually we use polysaccharide to kind of store excess glucose, excess energy. Used for energy storage. So in plants, they form starch. So starch has hundreds and hundreds of glucose molecules are linked together. So if the plant gets excess glucose, then the plant is going to store it. So it's going to link all the glucose together to form starch. Okay? So if the plant needs energy, then it's going to break down the starch to get glucose for energy. So it's a storage, usually for polysaccharides. Okay? For animals, we don't make starch, right? Have you ever, eaten an animal product and it contains starch? No. So only plants can use starch. For animals, we store excess glucose in the form of glycogen. And remember, glyco means sugar. So glycogen is also a very large molecule consisting of hundreds and hundreds of glucose. So when you eat too much food, your body is gonna, take in all the glucose and use them as building blocks to make glycogen. The next function for polysaccharides is often structural support, which we mentioned earlier. So plants use cellulose. Okay, it's very hard to digest. Humans don't have the enzymes to digest cellulose. So those fibers are indigestible to us. But some animals like cows, sheep, buffaloes, they have the special bacteria in their stomach that can help them break down the large cellulose fibers. Another form of polysaccharide found in animals, some animals in arthropods, is called a chitin. So chitin is the carbohydrate component in these animals' exoskeleton, because you can see the hard shell, right? So a big component in those shells is a chitin, and the chitin is carbohydrate. Okay, this just to show you the cellulose structure. So the cellulose are big fibers, very big fibers. But when we look more closely, they're just made of glucose. Okay, so one glucose, second, third, so you have hundreds and hundreds of glucose all bonded by chemical bond, and they're going to form cellulose fibers. Now, what's special about this is the glucose are linked together in a special way. Okay, so every other glucose is going to be linked kind of upside down. Okay, so that forms a very kind of tough structure. So this is more information about polysaccharide. You don't have to memorize anything from this slide. It really just shows you that the polysaccharides are made of multiple subunits of monomers, right? And in this case, this is starch, so the monomers are glucose. So starch has these two types of polysaccharides, amylose, amylopectin, right? They're both made of glucose.